The air in the airport lounge buzzed with a restless energy, a subtle symphony of clinking glasses, hushed voices, and the faint crinkle of newspapers being turned. Amid the ebb and flow of travelers, Stella Carter stood apart, a figure of understated grace cutting through the chaos like a lighthouse beam. Piercing a foggy night, she stepped into the room with an air of quiet authority, her caramel skin catching the warm glow of the overhead lights, her natural curls cascading around her face like a regal frame. Dressed in a navy blue pantsuit that hugged her tall, statuesque frame just right, she exuded a confidence that didn't shout but whispered powerfully nonetheless. A single gold bracelet gleamed softly on her wrist, its simplicity mirrored by the pearl studs adorning her earsmall, tokens of elegance that spoke volumes about her refined taste. In her hand, she carried a sleek leather briefcase, its surface embossed with her initials, a cherished gift from her late mother. That briefcase wasn't just a tool of her trade. It was a tangible link to a legacy of grit and sacrifice, a reminder of the steep climb that had brought her to this moment. Stella's sharp eyes swept the lounge with a practiced calm, taking in the swirl of faces and fleeting glances with the detachment of someone who'd long ago learned to shield her heart from the world's scrutiny. She was no stranger to the weight of being watch-adjudged. Real ivory step she took as the owner of one of the country's most prominent airlines magnified, under a microscope of expectation and bias. Today was supposed to be routine, a quick stop before a business meeting, but she knew better than most that nothing about her life was ever truly ordinary. Trailing just behind her was James, her assistant, a weary young man in his mid-20s whose quick steps betrayed a mix of eagerness and nerves. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice a little too tight, "your documents for the meeting are all set." There was reverence in his tone, tinged with the faint anxiety of someone still finding his footing under her formidable shadow. James had been with her long enough to marvel at her precision and unshakable integrity, but her intensity, that still rattled him sometimes. "Thank you, James," Stella replied, her voice a low, steady hum that seemed to anchor the space around her. She had a way of speaking that drew people in it through volume, but through the sheer gravity of her words. "We'll go over them once we're settled." She chose a secluded corner of the lounge, a deliberate retreat from the curious eyes that often tracked her movements. Being a black woman in her position wasn't just rare, it was a lightning rod for stares, whispers, and assumptions. She'd grown used to with sidelong glances, the barely concealed surprise bit that didn't mean it ever stopped stinging. As she eased into her seat, the leather cushion sighing beneath her, she caught the faint murmur of voices from a cluster of travelers near the bar, their heads tilted subtly in her direction, their words too soft to catch but their intent as clear as day. Stella let it roll off her, a skill honed over years of picking her fights with surgical precision. Her focus shifted back to James, who was fussing with a stack of files on the table. "Put the financial report at the top," she instructed, her tone crisp. "That's our ace for locking in the next round of funding." James nodded, his fingers fumbling slightly as he rearranged the papers, but his attention snagged on something or someone approaching their corner. Stella felt it too, a ripple in the air, like the first tremor before a storm. She glanced up to see a woman striding toward them, her presence loud in a way Stella's never was. Mid-40s, blonde, and draped in an outfit that screamed money but lacked taste. The woman carried herself with the kind of swagger that came from never being told no. Her name, Stella would later discover, was Karina, a moniker that had come to embody a certain breed of entitlement, the kind that wielded privilege like a blunt instrument. Karen's eyes raked over Stella, lingering too long, sizing her up with a scrutiny that felt like a challenge. Stella met her gaze head-on, unflinching, her expression a mask of serene defiance. She knew that look all too well, mental arithmetic of someone deciding if she fit, if she belonged. But Stella offered no hints, no cracks in her armor. She simply waited, daring Karen to make her move. Karen's lips tightened into a thin line, her manicured fingers adjusting the oversized handbag slung over her shoulder. Then, with a sharp pivot, she marched toward a flight attendant stationed near the bar. Stella watched, her fingers brushing the cool leather of her briefcase as Karen's gestures grew more animated, her voice rising just enough to slice through the lounge's ambient hum. The words weren't clear yet, but the venom in her tone was unmistakable. Stella took a slow, deep breath, steadying herself. She'd crossed paths with Karens before, people who saw her success, her poise, and felt threatened by it. The question wasn't if this would escalate, it was how far Karen would push, and whether she'd realize too late who she was tangling with. The lounge's chatter dimmed, as if the room itself held its breath, sensing the brewing clash. Karen's voice sharpened, cutting through the haze like a jagged blade. She leaned toward the flight attendant, a young woman barely out of her teens, her uniform pristine and her dark hair pulled back into a tight bun. The girl's wide eyes flicked nervously between Karen and Stella, her hands twisting together as she tried to maintain her composure under the onslaught. "I'm telling you," Karen snapped, her tone dripping with indignation. "That woman doesn't belong here. This is a first-class lounge, and I know who's supposed to be in a place like this." She jabbed a finger towards Stella, her movements jerky with righteous fury. The attendant froze, her face a canvas of uncertainty, clearly torn between protocol and the pressure bearing down on her. Stella sat motionless, her posture relaxed, but her mind racing beneath the surface. She felt the old, familiar ache rise in her chest, not anger, not yet, but a bone-deep weariness. How many times had she been here? How many times had she been forced to prove her worth, her right to breathe the same air as everyone else in rooms like this? Beside her, James shifted in his seat, his brow creasing with unease. He leaned closer, his voice a hushed whisper. "Miss Carter, should I?" "No," she cut him off, her tone soft but ironclad. "We wait." She wouldn't give Karen the satisfaction of a reaction, not yet. Let her dig her own grave. Karen, emboldened by the attendant's hesitation, straightened up, folding her arms across her chest like a general issuing orders. "Go on," she pressed, her voice teetering on the edge of a sneer. "Ask her for her boarding pass. I've seen this before, people sneaking in, acting like they belong when they don't." The accusation hung heavy in the air, sharp and deliberate, designed to wound. A ripple of murmurs spread through the lounge, heads turning as passengers craned to see the drama unfold. Some watched with idle curiosity, others with flushed cheeks and averted eyes. But no one intervened. Stella met their stares with a steady gaze, her dignity a fortress they couldn't breach. She'd learned long ago that showing weakness in moments like this was blood in the water. Let them smell it, and they'd never stop circling. The flight attendant, now visibly trembling, took a tentative step towards Stella. "Ma'am," she began, her voice cracking like thin ice, "I'm so sorry to bother you, but could I see your boarding pass and lounge credentials?" Her eyes pleaded for forgiveness, but her words still landed like a slap. Stella raised her gaze slowly, locking eyes with the girl. There was no heat in her expression, only a quiet, piercing clarity that made the attendant squirm. "And why?" Stella asked, her voice a smooth, measured drawl. "Do you need to see them?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of a lifetime spent justifying her existence. The attendant faltered, her cheeks flaring red. "It's just a routine check," she stammered. But the lie was flimsy, and they both knew it. Stella hadn't raised her voice, hadn't disturbed a soul. This wasn't routine, it was prejudice wearing a flimsy mask of procedure. From her vantage point a few feet away, Karen smirked, her arms still crossed, her posture radiating smug triumph. "See," she called out, loud enough for the room to hear. "If she really belongs here, she'll show you. What's the problem?" The taunt was a spark tossed onto dry grass, daring Stella to ignite. But Stella didn't rush to answer. Instead, she reached for her briefcase with a slow, deliberate grace, her movements a quiet symphony of control. She clicked it open, the sound sharp in the tense silence, and let the moment stretch. Inside her, a storm churned danger, yes, but also a fierce resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd ever been made to feel small by someone like Karen. It was about justice, about the cost of power wielded without conscience. As her fingers brushed the documents inside, Stella's mind flickered to her mother, the woman who'd gifted her that briefcase with tears in her eyes and pride in her voice. "You're going to change the world, Stella," she'd said. "Don't ever let them tell you otherwise." That memory steadied her now, a lifeline in the chaos. She pulled out her boarding pass and credentials. holding them up just long enough for the attendant to see before setting them on the table. "I assume this satisfies you," she said, her tone cool but laced with an edge that cut deeper than any shout. The attendant nodded quickly, retreating with a mumbled apology. But Stella's eyes slid past her to Karen, who stood frozen, her smirk faltering. What Karen didn't know she couldn't have known was that Stella wasn't just any traveler. She was the airline's owner, a titan in a world that had tried to box her in at every turn. And in that moment, as the lounge held its breath, Stella decided Karen would learn a lesson she'd never forget. Arrogance could blind you. But justice had a way of shining through, unyielding and bright, exposing every shadow for what it was. The consequences of Karen's actions were about to unfold, a reckoning born not of vengeance, but of the quiet, unshakable strength of a woman who knew her worth and wouldn't let anyone take it away. Stella slid her fingers into the sleek leather bag, her movements deliberate and graceful. As though she were unwrapping a treasure, she pulled out a slim, elegant wallet, its surface gleaming faintly under the soft glow of the airport lounge's chandelier. From within, she retrieved a black and gold card, its edges crisp and embossed with the airline's logo, a proud insignia paired with the words, "Owner's Pass." She held it delicately between her fingertips, tilting it ever so slightly so the light danced across its glossy finish, casting tiny reflections like stars on a midnight sea. "Here you go," she said, extending the card to the flight attendant. Her voice was steady, almost melodic, but beneath its calm surface lay a quiet graviton, unspoken declaration of all she had fought for, all she had built over years of relentless determination. The flight attendant's hands quivered as she accepted the card, her fingers brushing against Stella's with the hesitance of someone handling something fragile, yet dangerous. She stared at it, her breath catching as her eyes traced the elegant script, "Miss Carter." Her lips parted, and her voice emerged as a shaky whisper, barely audible above the hum of the lounge. Miss Carter didn't realize. Her wide eyes betrayed a mix of awe and sudden panic, as if the card had transformed from a mere object into a revelation she wasn't prepared to face. Nearby, Karen edged closer, her curiosity piqued. She leaned over the attendant's shoulder, her sharp features tightening as she read the card's inscription. The smirk she'd worn moments ago, a smug, self-assured twist of her lips faltered, then vanished entirely. "What's that supposed to mean?" she snapped, her voice rising with a defensive edge that cut through the ambient chatter of the lounge. "Anyone could whip up a fake card like that. It doesn't prove anything." Her words were laced with skepticism, but there was a tremor beneath them, a crack in her confidence she couldn't quite conceal. Stella tilted her head, a subtle gesture that carried the weight of quiet amusement. A faint smile tugged at the corners of her mouth, softening her otherwise composed expression. "A fake card?" she echoed, her tone light but deliberate, as if savoring the absurdity of the accusation. "Is that your expert opinion, Karen?" Her words hung in the air, sharp yet playful, daring Karen to dig herself deeper. Karen's mouth opened, then closed, her face flushing as she scrambled for a retort that wouldn't come. Before she could muster a response, the atmosphere shifted. The sound of polished shoes clicking against the marble floor announced a new presence, a man in a tailored suit, his stride brisk and purposeful. He moved with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command, his dark eyes scanning the scene as he approached. The flight attendant straightened instantly, her spine stiffening as if pulled by an invisible string, her grip tightening on Stella's card. "Miss Carter," the man said, his voice warm but polished, "carrying the professionalism of years in the industry. I didn't expect to see you here today. Is everything all right?" His gaze lingered on her, respectfully yet probing, as though he sensed the tension simmering beneath the surface. Karen's face drained of color, her eyes darting between the man and Stella as the pieces began to fall into place. The lounge, once a backdrop of idle murmurs and clinking glasses, now buzzed with the curiosity of onlookers, passers craning their necks, their whispers growing louder as they watched the drama unfold. Stella met the man's gaze with a nod, her expression serene yet unyielding. "Good afternoon, Mr. Linwood," she replied, her voice smooth as glass. "It seems there's been a slight misunderstanding with some of your staff and guests." Her words were measured, but they carried an undercurrent of steel, a reminder of who she was and what she represented. Linwood's sharp eyes flicked to the flight attendant, then settled on Karen, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Miss Carter is the owner of this airline," he said, his tone firm and unapologetic, cutting through the air like a blade. "Her pass isn't just valid, it grants her the highest level of access we offer." The statement landed with the weight of a judge's gavel, silencing the room. Stella leaned back in her chair, her posture relaxed yet regal, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest. She said nothing, letting Linwood's words sink in, their truth reverberating through the lounge like ripples on still water. Karen's lips parted as if to argue, but no sound emerged. Her carefully constructed facade began to crumble, her cheeks flushing a deep crimson as her eyes darted frantic first to Stella, then to Linwood, then to the flight attendant, searching for a lifeline in a sea of faces that had turned cold and judgmental. But no one stepped forward to save her. Stella remained seated, her presence as steady as a monarch on her throne. The gold bracelet on her wrist caught the light, a subtle shimmer against the rich brown of her skin, amplifying the quiet power she exuded. In that moment, she wasn't just a woman defending her place, she was a testament to resilience, a living embodiment of strength forged through years of overcoming doubt and defiance. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the faint clink of a spoon against a porcelain cup at a distant tabli, a mundane sound that somehow amplified the tension. Karen shattered it first, her voice shrill and brittle, like glass on the verge of breaking. "Owner of the airline, that's ridiculous," she scoffed, forcing a laugh that echoed awkwardly in the stillness. She jabbed a manicured finger towards Stella, her movements jerky with desperation. "You're telling me she owns this place? There's no way." Her bravado rang hollow, a flimsy shield against the truth staring her down. Linwood adjusted his tie with a precise, almost impatient motion, his calm authority slicing through Karen's denial. "Miss Carter is not only the owner, but also the chairwoman of the board," he said, his voice steady but edged with a quiet reprimand. "She oversees our operations, our policies, and, I might add, our reputation." His gaze lingered on Karen as he spoke that final word, letting it hang in the air like a warning. She stumbled back a step, her confidence visibly unraveling, though Stella could see the stubborn entitlement flickering in her eyes. Karen wasn't the type to surrender gracefully. Squaring her shoulders, Karen jetted out her chin, clinging to her defiance like a drowning woman to driftwood. "Well," she began, her tone dripping with sarcasm, "if that's true, why was she sitting here like some regular passenger? Shouldn't the owner of an airline have her own private lounge or something? How was I supposed to know?" Her words were a desperate grasp at justification, but they landed flat, exposing her pettiness to the room. Stella's gaze shifted to Karen, her expression unreadable yet piercing. When she spoke, her voice was smooth as silk, laced with a subtle edge that cut deeper than any shout. "I wasn't aware that ownership came with a requirement to broadcast my status," she said, her tone almost playful, though her eyes held no humor. "But perhaps next time I'll bring a neon sign just to spare you the confusion." The sarcasm was velvet-trapped steel, sharp enough to draw blood without raising her voice. Karen's mouth opened, but Linwood raised a hand, silencing her with a single gesture. "Miss Carter," he said, turning to her with a sincerity that carried an undercurrent of urgency. "On behalf of the airline, I deeply apologize for this misunderstanding." His words were genuine, but Stella sensed the tension beneath them. He wasn't just apologizing. He was trying to contain a situation teetering on the edge of chaos. She leaned back, crossing one leg over the other with effortless grace, her composure unshaken. "Thank you, Mr. Linwood," she replied, her voice calm but firm. "But an apology alone doesn't address the root of this, does it?" The question lingered, heavy with implication, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Karen's defiance faltered, her eyes flickering with unease as the weight of Stella's presence pressed down on her. The murmurs from the other passengers had faded, leaving only the faint strains of lounge music, a soft jazz melody that underscored the gravity of the moment. "What do you mean, Miss Carter?" Linwood asked, though his furrowed brow suggested he already suspected her answer. Stella straightened, her presence expanding to fill the space, even as she remained seated. "I mean that moments like this aren't accidents," she said, her voice carrying a quiet power that demanded attention. They're symptoms of deeper biases that have no place in an organization. I've poured my life into building. Her words were a mirror held up to the room, reflecting uncomfortable truths no one could deny. Linwood nodded slowly, his expression darkening with resolve. You're absolutely right, he said. I'll ensure this is addressed immediately. Karen, sensing her defeat was inevitable, made one last frantic bid to salvage her dignity. Look, I didn't mean anything by it, she said, her voice taking on a cloying sweetness that made Stella's skin prickle. I just thought Nyon could have made the same mistake, right? Her plea was desperate, a flimsy attempt to rewrite the narrative, but Stella's gaze cut through it like a blade. A mistake, Stella repeated, her voice soft but piercing, each syllable laced with quiet fury. Is that what you call judging someone by the color of their skin? Karen's face flushed an even deeper red, her mouth working soundlessly as she stammered. To didn't mean of course Noti, just her words tripped over each other, a disjointed mess of denial that crumbled under scrutiny. You thought I didn't belong here, Stella interrupted, her tone unwavering, her eyes locking onto Karen's with unrelenting intensity. You assumed, without a shred of evidence, that I was out of place, and then you turned that assumption into a confrontation. Despite having no authority to do so, the room seemed to shrink around Karen, the weight of Stella's accusation pressing down until she could barely breathe. Her mouth opened and closed, but no defense emerged, only silence, thick and suffocating. Stella turned to the flight attendant, her gaze softening slightly, but still firm. And you, she said, her voice gentling but retaining its edge. I understand you were caught in a difficult spot, but it's your duty to handle situations like this with professionalism and fairness. Asking me to justify my presence here, based on one person's baseless accusations, wasn't just unprofessional, it was a failure of judgment. The attendant's hands trembled, her eyes dropping to the floor as shame colored her cheeks. In the stillness that followed, Stella leaned back, her composure a stark contrast to the chaos she'd unraveled. Justice, she thought, didn't always roar, it whispered, steady and unyielding, until the truth could no longer be ignored. And as the lounge watched, spellbound, she remained a quiet storm, a woman whose power lay not in volume, but in the unshakable strength of her convictions. The sting of discrimination hung thick in the air as the flight attendant stood there, her eyes brimming with unshed tears that glistened under the soft glow of the lounge's dim lighting. Her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides, fingers twisting together as if trying to wring out the guilt that consumed her. With a quick, shaky nod, she whispered, I'm so sorry, Miss Carter. Her voice was fragile, barely audible over the hum of distant conversations, as though speaking any louder might shatter her entirely. I didn't mean to offend Yowie, swear I didn't. The words tumbled out in a rush, raw and unpolished, laced with a desperation to undo what had been done. Stella Carter sat across from her, poised in a high-backed chair that seemed to amplify her commanding presence. Her expression softened ever so slightly, the hard edges of her disappointment giving way to something gentle, not forgiveness, not yet, but an acknowledgement of the woman's remorse. Apologies are a start, Stella said, her tone measured and deliberate, each word carrying the weight of someone who had heard such sentiments too many times before. But it's actions that carry the real meaning. Her dark eyes held the flight attendant's gaze for a moment longer, conveying a quiet challenge. Prove it. Sensing the tension still crackling in the room, Mr. Linwood, the lounge manager, stepped forward with the brisk efficiency of a man accustomed to putting out fires. His polished shoes clicked sharply against the tiled floor, and his suit, crisp, dark, and impeccably tailored, seemed to scream authority. Miss Carter, he said, his voice firm but tinged with a practiced deference. I'll make sure this incident is fully documented and dealt with immediately. He straightened his posture, as if physically aligning himself with the solution he proposed. The flight attendant will undergo additional training to prevent this from happening again. And as for this guest, his eyes flicked toward Karen, the woman at the center of the storm. With a sharpness that could have cut glass, she'll be escorted out of the lounge at once. Karen, standing a few feet away, let out a gasp that sliced through the murmurs of the room. Her face flushed red, a mix of indignation and disbelief. But the sound went unnoticed by those around her, swallowed up by the indifference of the other patrons. No one spared her a glance as two staff members flanked her, their expressions blank but resolute, guiding her toward the exit. Her approach shrill at first, then fading into a pitiful whine briefly before dissolving into the hum of the lounges. Returning normalcy, Stella tilted her head slightly, a subtle nod that acknowledged Linwood's swift response without fully letting him off the hook. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of expectation. She watched as Karen disappeared through the glass doors, her silhouette shrinking into the distance, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of satisfaction warmed Stella's chest. This wasn't just about her own dignity, though that mattered deeply. It was about drawing a line in the sand, about sending a message that rippled through the plush chairs and polished tables of the lounge. Prejudice and unchecked privilege had no foothold here, not in the world she was determined to shape. The room settled back into its usual rhythms of clinks of glasses, the murmur of conversations, the occasional rustle of a newspaper, but the air still buzzed with the aftershocks of the confrontation. Stella remained seated, her posture regal, her tailored blazer hugging her frame like armor. Beneath her composed exterior, though, a tempest of emotions churned. She had faced moments like this, countless time-sharp jabs of bias, subtle dismissals, the exhausting need to prove herself over and over again. Each time, she stood firm, not just for her own sake, but for the countless others who bore the same burdens. This wasn't merely about a rude guest or a misstep in a lounge. It was a battle in a much larger war, one fought in quiet moments and bold stands alike. Beside her, James, her assistant, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as he tugged at the knot of his tie, a nervous habit that betrayed his unease. His brow furrowed, and his voice, when he spoke, was soft, threaded with worry. "Miss Carter, are you okay?" He leaned toward her, his hazel eyes searching her face for any crack in her unshakable facade. Stella turned to him, her gaze softening just enough to ease his concern. "I'm fine, James," she said, her tone steady as steel, a quiet reassurance woven into the words. "Moments like these, they are part of the path I've chosen." Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, not out of amusement, but as a shield against the weariness she refused to let him see. James nodded, but the tightness in his jaw told her he wasn't convinced. "It shouldn't have to be like this," he muttered, his frustration bubbling to the surface. He shook his head, dark curls falling into his eyes. "You've built this airline from nothing, poured your heart into it, and still." People, he trailed off, unable to finish the thought, his hands clenching into fists on his lap. Stella reached out, resting a hand lightly on his arm. Her touch was gentle but firm, grounding him in the midst of his anger. "People will always find ways to tear down what they can't comprehend," she said, her voice low and steady, carrying the wisdom of years spent navigating such storms. "The trick is not letting them win." Her eyes drifted across the lounge, landing on a small cluster of passengers near the bar. They whispered among themselves, their glances darting toward Hersom with curiosity, others with a flicker of shame. She felt the weight of their stares, a familiar burden she'd carried since she was old enough to understand why they looked. Some had averted their eyes during the incident, unwilling to get involved, their silence a quiet complicity she'd long since stopped resenting. Others had watched with a twisted fascination, as if her pain were a spectacle to dissect. Stella had learned early on not to rely on bystanders. That lesson had been etched into her soul through years of standing alone. Her reverie broke as the sound of purposeful footsteps approached. Mr. Linwood returned, his face a careful mask of regret and resolve. In one hand, he held a tablet, the airline's logo glinting on its sleek surface like a badge of his authority. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone respectful but edged with a quiet confidence. "I've drafted a report about what happened. If you'd like, I can file it right now, and we'll start putting measures in place to address the concerns you raised." He stood a little taller, clearly hoping his initiative would smooth over the tension. Stella regarded him for a long moment, her sharp eyes cutting through his polished exterior. She could see the sincerity in his effort, but she also recognized the limits of his understanding. Linwood was a man who had likely never felt the sting of being judged by the color of his skin, or the assumptions tied to his name. Still, His willingness to act was something she could work with. "Let me see it," she said, her voice even but firm. He handed her the tablet, and she scanned the report with a critical eye. The document was detailed, outlining the events with clinical precision. Karen's outburst. The flight attendant's misstep it as she read, her lips pressed into a thin line. The words, though professional, felt hollow, stripped of the raw truth she'd lived through. It labeled Karen's behavior as inappropriate and the flight attendant's actions as a lapse in judgment, but it sidestepped the deeper currents of bias and entitlement that had fueled the incident. "This is a good beginning," Stella said, setting the tablet down with a soft clack against the table. "But it's not enough." Her tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it, an unyielding resolve that made Linwood blink in surprise. "Not enough," he echoed, his brow creasing as he tried to process her words. Stella leaned forward, her presence filling the space between them. "This wasn't just a misunderstanding," she said, her voice rising slightly with the weight of her conviction. "It was about the systemic biases that embolden people like Karen to think they can dictate who belongs where. It's about the quiet assumptions that made your staff question me without reason." Linwood opened his mouth to reply, but she raised a hand, silencing him with the gesture. "If we're going to fix this," she continued, "we need to dig deeper. Diversity training won't cut it. We need to reshape this company's culture, starting with who we hire, how we train them, and how we hold them accountable when moments like this arise." Her words landed like stones, each one sinking into Linwood's carefully constructed confidence. He shifted his weight, visibly grappling with the magnitude of what she was asking. "I understand," he said at last, his voice quieter now, humbled. "I'll revise the report and work with HR to create a more thorough plan." Stella nodded, a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Good. And make sure it includes regular check-ins to track progress. This isn't a quick patch, it's a long-term promise." Linwood hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "Of course, Miss Carter. I'll get started right away." He turned to leave, his steps less certain than when he'd arrived. As he departed, Stella's gaze swept back to the lounge. The group at the bar had thinned out, though a few stragglers lingered, their eyes flicking toward her before darting away. She paid them no mind. James, who had stayed silent during the exchange, finally spoke, his voice warm with admiration. "You handled that like a master," he said, shaking his head in awe. "I don't know how you keep so steady." Stella allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "It's not about keeping steady," she said, her words quiet but resolute. "It's about keeping control." The statement lingered between them, a testament to the resilience she'd forged through years of trials. She reached for her briefcase, preparing to leave for her next meeting, a renewed fire burning in her chest. Today had reminded her why she fought so fiercely to carve out spaces where no one had to feel small, where justice wasn't just a whisper but a roar. But the day wasn't over yet. As she rose, the sound of hurried footsteps caught her attention. She turned to see the young flight attendant approaching, her face pale but set with determination. Her uniform was slightly wrinkled, a sign of the turmoil she'd been wrestling with since their earlier encounter. "Miss Carter," the woman said, her voice quivering but earnest, "I just wanted to apologize again. What I did was wrong, and to want to be better." Her hands clasped tightly in front of her, knuckles white with the effort to hold herself together. Stella studied her, searching for the truth behind the words. She found it in the attendant's wide, glistening ice canoe in regret, a spark of resolve. "Apologies matter," Stella said, her tone softening, "but what you do next matters more. If you mean what you say, I expect to see you lead by example." The attendant nodded quickly, a tear slipping down her cheek as gratitude lit her face. "Thank you, Miss Carter. I won't let you down." She turned and walked away, her steps lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Stella watched her go, a quiet satisfaction settling over her. These small victories, fleeting as they might seem, were the threads of change she wove into the world. They were proof that justice could take root, even in the hardest soil, one person at a time. As she left the lounge, the burden of the day eased just a fraction. She had faced prejudice and risen above it, as she always did, but more than that. She had sown seeds of accountability, knowing their impact would stretch far beyond this single afternoon. The lesson was clear. Power misused brought consequences, and justice, when pursued with unwavering resolve, could echo through even the quietest corners. The airport lounge settled back into its subdued rhythm, the soft hum of conversations, and the clinking of glassware resuming as if nothing had happened. Yet the air carried a subtle charge, a quiet electricity born from the confrontation that had just unfolded. Stella strode out of the room, her assistant James trailing close behind, their footsteps reverberating faintly against the gleaming marble floors. The polished surface reflected the dim overhead lights, casting a glossy sheen that stretched endlessly before them. Even as they moved toward the meeting that loomed on her horizon, Stella couldn't shake the sensation clinging to hear a heavy, brooding presence, like the oppressive stillness before a thunderstorm breaks loose. Her instincts, sharp and finely honed from years of navigating treacherous waters, whispered a warning. Karen. The name pulsed in her mind, conjuring the memory of that voice tight with resentment, dripping with entitlement as though privilege were a fragrance she wore too proudly. Stella knew people like Karen didn't simply slink away, tails between their legs. No, they struck back, clawing desperately to reclaim the dominance they assumed was their birthright. She stole a glance at James, whose brow creased deeply, his fingers tightening around the tablet cradling her meticulously prepared presentation. His hazel eyes flickered with a quiet storm of his own, a blend of focus and unease. "James," she said, her tone steady yet laced with an undercurrent of steel, "stay close." Her words cut through the ambient noise like a lifeline tossed into choppy seas. He looked up, startled, his lips parting slightly. "Of course, Miss Carter," he replied, but the faint tremor in his voice betrayed the concern simmering beneath his composed exterior. He understood her caution, perhaps more than he let on. James had been with her long enough to recognize the signs, the way her posture stiffened, ever so slightly, the way her gaze sharpened like a blade honed for battle. They had barely reached the sleek, private elevator tucked away near the terminal's edge when a flurry of hurried footsteps shattered the steady drone of the airport. The sound was sharp, insistent, a staccato rhythm that set Stella's nerves alight. She didn't need to turn to know who it was. Karen's voice sliced through the air, jagged and accusing, like a whip cracking against stone. "Wait, you can't just walk away like that." Stella exhaled a slow, measured breath, her chest rising and falling as she turned with deliberate calm to face her pursuer. Karen stormed toward her, a tempest in human form. Her face was flushed a deep crimson, her designer handbag swinging wildly from her arm like a pendulum, marking the seconds of her outrage. Every inch of her screamed wounded privilegier-tailored coat slightly askew, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the leather strap of her bag. She looked like a woman scorned not by a lover, but by the universe itself, furious that it had dared to defy her expectations. "I didn't appreciate the way you humiliated me back there," Karen spat, her voice quivering with a volatile mix of fury and shame. "You think you can just flash your title around, make me the villain? I was only doing what I thought was right." Her words hung in the air, brittle and defensive, as if she could will them into truth by sheer force of will. Stella regarded her with an unwavering gaze, her expression a mask of cool neutrality that hid the storm brewing within. "What you thought was right," she echoed, her voice low and deliberate. Each syllable weighted with quiet power, was jumping to baseless conclusions about me. And when those assumptions crumbled, instead of owning your error, you dug in deeper. Her words weren't loud, but they carried the force of a gavel striking wood, final and unyielding. Karen bristled, her lips twisting into a sneer that bared her teeth. "Error, you were sitting there like you owned the Plisso. Wait, you do own the place, don't you?" Her laugh was harsh, a grating sound that scraped against the polished surroundings. "Must be nice, playing the victim when everything's just handed to you on a silver platter." The bitterness in her tone was palpable, a venom born from years of unchecked entitlement. Beside Stella, James tensed, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the tablet harder. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching faintly, but before he could speak, Stella rested a gentle hand on his arm. "Don't," she murmured, her voice soft as a breeze yet firm as iron. She'd faced this kind of venom before countless times, in fact, and she knew its rhythm, its cadence. She knew how to dance with it without letting it draw blood. Karen, emboldened by Stella's silence, pressed forward, her eyes glinting with reckless defiance. "You know what I think? You're the problem here. You strut around acting superior, making everyone else feel small just to prove some grand point." "Well, I'm not apologizing for standing up for what's right." Her voice rose, trembling with conviction, as if volume alone could cement her righteousness. Stella took a single, measured step forward, her heels clicking softly against the marble. Her posture was unyielding, her gaze locking onto Karen's with an intensity that seemed to pin her in place. For the first time, Karen faltered, her bravado flickering like a candle caught in a draft. "You think you stood up for what's right?" Stella asked, her voice calm but edged with a razor's precision. "What you defended was your own prejudice. You decided I didn't belong because I didn't match your tiny, rigid idea of who gets to sit in that lounge. And when the truth stared you in the face, you chose ignorance over reflection." Karen opened her mouth, a retort poised on her tongue, but Stella pressed on, her words flowing like a river carving through stone. "I've spent my entire life clawing my way to where I stand. Nothing was handed to me. Every inch I've gained came through sweat, sleepless nights, and sacrifices you can't begin to imagine. And people like you, who wield their privilege like a weapon to tear others down, are exactly why I fight so hard to build spaces where everyone gets a fair shot." The terminal seemed to hold its breath, the distant hum of jet engines and rolling suitcases fading into a hushed stillness. Karen stared at her, her face a battlefield of emotion's anger warring with unease, pride wrestling with something softer, less certain. For a fleeting moment, it looked as though she might lash out again, her chest heaving with the effort of holding herself together. But then her shoulders sagged, the fire in her eyes dimming as she averted her gaze. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she mumbled, her voice so faint it barely reached Stella's ears. Stella studied her, searching those downturned eyes for a glimmer of genuine remorse. "It's not about how far it went," she said, her tone softening but still firm. "It's about what you do now. If you're truly sorry, you'll use this as a chance to look inward, to grow. But if you keep clinging to excuses, you'll just stumble into the same pit again." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Karen said nothing, her eyes fixed on the floor, her fingers loosening their grip on her bag. After a beat, Stella turned to James, her voice quiet but resolute. "Let's go." They stepped into the private elevator, the doors sliding shut with a whisper. Inside the confined space, Stella allowed herself a moment to breathe, the tension in her shoulders unwinding just a fraction. She knew Karen's type too well, knew that a muttered apology didn't mean the war was won. But she also knew she couldn't shoulder the burden of reshaping every stubborn heart. Her fight was bigger, rooted in the systems she could change, the culture she could shift, the doors she could pry open for those who'd come after her. James stood beside her, his presence a steady anchor in the storm. He shifted, breaking the silence with a hesitant murmur. "Miss Carter, do you think she'll learn anything from this?" His voice was tinged with doubt, his brow still furrowed as he clutched the tablet like a shield. Stella's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile, her eyes distant as she watched the elevator's lights climb. "That's up to her," she said simply. "But whether she does or not, the work doesn't stop." The doors parted with a soft chime, revealing the sleek expanse of the conference room awaiting her. The space was a masterpiece of modern design, floor-to-ceiling glass walls, framing the chaotic ballet of the runway beyond. A long mahogany table polished to a mirror-like sheen, and plush chairs aligned with military precision. The cool brush of air conditioning kissed her skin, a stark contrast to the heat of the class she'd just left behind. Her mind lingered on Karen's words, each syllable a splinter she couldn't quite dislodge. They were a reminder of the endless road ahead, the battles still to be fought. James moved to the head of the table, setting her tablet down with care, though his hands betrayed a lingering restlessness. Stella noticed the tightness in his shoulders, the faint shadow of worry etched into his young face. He'd always been her rock, a quiet strength amid the chaos of her world, but today, even he seemed rattled. "Take a breath, James," she said gently, her voice a soothing balm against the room's sterile tension. He froze, his hands gripping the table's edge, then looked at her with eyes brimming with a mix of frustration and awe. "How do you do it, Miss Carter?" he asked, his tone raw with disbelief. How do you stay so steady after all that? Stella eased into her seat at the table's head, her movements fluid and graceful, as though resilience were a second skin she'd long since mastered. She rested her hands on the smooth wood, her gold bracelet glinting under the recessed lights as she motioned for him to sit. "It's not about burying what you feel," she said, her voice soft but sure. "It's about harnessing it. Every time I face someone like Karen, every time I'm underestimated or misjudged, I remind myself what's on the line. Losing my grip would only hand them the victory they crave a reason to write me off. Staying steady, that's how I reclaim the power." James nodded slowly, though the tension in his frame didn't fully ease. Stella could see the gears turning in his mind, the slow dawning of a lesson that only time could solidify. For now, she trusted her example would guide him. The door swung open, and a handful of executives filtered in, their tailored suits and polished shoes a testament to the airline's prestige. They greeted her with nods of respect and familiarity, each one keenly aware of the influence she wielded. As they settled into their seats, Stella shifted her focus, channeling her energy into the task ahead. The echoes of Karen's outburst lingered like a distant thunderclap, a reminder of the fight for justice that never truly ended, and the consequences of power misused. But they also underscored the small triumphs, the moments of clarity, that made every step of the struggle worth it. Stella stood at the head of the conference table, her voice resonating with a calm yet unshakable authority as she prepared to steer the meeting toward its purpose. Before diving into the day's planned discussions, she paused, her piercing gaze sweeping across the room, locking eyes with the executives seated before her. Their faces betrayed a tangle of emotions, curiosity flickering in some, unease shadowing others as they exchanged fleeting glances. Without hesitation, Stella launched into a recounting of an unsettling incident that had unfolded earlier in the executive lounge. Her words flowed with precision, each syllable deliberate, conjuring a vivid scene in their minds, the sharp sting of prejudice, the heavy weight of injustice, laid bare without embellishment. She didn't soften the edges or dodge the raw truths about bias and discrimination that had seeped into their carefully curated corporate world. When she finished, a thick, suffocating silence descended, pressing down on the room like a storm cloud. The executives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, their eyes darting anywhere but toward her, the air thick with their unspoken guilt. After what felt like an eternity, one of them broke the stillness, a man in his 50s, his salt-and-pepper hair catching the dim light, his voice tentative yet measured. "Miss Carter," he began, clearing his throat as if to steady himself, "I want you to know we're taking this seriously. What happened, that it's unacceptable. We'll do whatever it takes to ensure it doesn't happen again." His words carried a cautious sincerity, but Stella's eyes narrowed slightly, her mind already dissecting his intent. She leaned forward, her tone firm yet laced with an undercurrent of expectation. "I appreciate that, Mr. Harris," she replied, "but words of concern are just the beginning. What we need is action, tangible, meaningful steps to uproot the problem. That means overhauling our training, rethinking how we hire, and confronting the culture we've allowed to fester here." Her voice didn't waver, and her gaze held his, daring him to look away. From the far end of the table, a younger executive stirred, her bright eyes alight with determination, her posture radiating resolve. She nodded vigorously, her dark hair swaying as she leaned into the conversation. "She's absolutely right," the woman said, her voice cutting through the lingering tension like a breath of fresh air. "If we're serious about leading this industry, we can't just react to scandals. We have to set a standard of what's right, not just what saves face." Her words sparked a shift in the room. The executives straightened, their hesitancy giving way to a flurry of ideas. Proposals bounced back and forth, each voice building on the last, and Stella listened intently, her sharp mind cataloging every suggestion. She interjected when needed, her insights precise and her demands for accountability unrelenting. By the time the meeting drew to a close, they'd hammered out a plan detailed, ambitious, with deadlines etched in stone. As the executives filed out, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous room, Stella remained seated, her hands resting lightly on her tablet, her thoughts still churning. James, her steadfast assistant, lingered nearby, his earlier stiffness melting into a quiet admiration. He adjusted his glasses, a faint smile tugging at his lips as he met her gaze. "That was something else," he said, his tone soft but genuine. "You didn't just tackle the issue, you turned it into a chance to change things." Stella's lips curved into a tired but authentic smile, her shoulders easing for the first time that day. "Opportunities don't always knock, James," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of weariness tempered by resolve. "Sometimes you have to kick the door down and make them yourself." Before he could respond, the heavy conference room door creaked open once more, and Stella's breath caught as Mr. Linwood stepped inside as lounge manager, his face a mosaic of nerves and determination. He hesitated at the threshold, his hands fidgeting before he crossed the room and sank into the chair across from her. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice trembling slightly despite his effort to steady it. "I just wanted to thank you for how you handled things earlier. It opened my eyes. We've got a long way to go, not just as a company, but as people." Stella studied him, her gaze piercing yet patient, searching for the depth of his sincerity. "And what do you intend to do about it?" she asked, her tone even but edged with expectation. Linwood swallowed hard, then squared his shoulders, a flicker of resolve igniting in his eyes. "I've already talked to my team," he said, his voice gaining strength. "We're starting with mandatory training for everyone, no exceptions. And I'm taking it on myself to learn more, to understand these issues better. I don't want to be part of a system that lets this happen." Stella's expression softened, though her scrutiny didn't waver. "Recognizing the problem is where it starts," she said, "but justice isn't a one-off fix. It's a commitment, a daily choice. Make sure your actions back up your words." He nodded, his face earnest, almost pleading. "I will," he promised, rising to his feet. "Thank you, Miss Carter." As he left, Stella leaned back in her chair, a quiet satisfaction settling over her like a well-earned reprieve. The war wasn't one there'd be more fights, more walls to tear down, but today, she'd carved out a victory, and that was enough for now. James lingered a moment longer, his tablet tucked under his arm, a playful glint in his eye. "You really do make your own opportunities," he said, his smile widening. Stella allowed herself a rare chuckle, the sound soft but genuine. "Someone's got to," she replied, gathering her things with a renewed sense of purpose. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she exited the room, James at her side, his stride brisk but relaxed now that the storm of the meeting had passed. The day had been a grueling marathon of confrontation and compromise, yet Stella's instinct by years of battling both corporate politics and personal prejudice told her the clouds hadn't fully parted. She'd seen it in Karen's eyes earlier, that defiant spark, the way her shoulders had stiffened even as she retreated. People like Karen didn't slink away quietly, they bided their time, plotting their revenge. As they approached the executive lounge, Stella's senses sharpened. The space, usually alive with the low hum of conversation and the clink of coffee cups, was unnaturally still. She stepped inside, her eyes sweeping the room with practiced precision. A cluster of staff hovered near the bar, their whispers barely audible, their faces taut with unease. A security guard stood awkwardly by the entrance, his broad frame shifting as his gaze flickered between Stella and a disturbance brewing at the far end of the room. And there she was, Karen, standing in the center of the lounge, her voice slicing through the silence like a jagged blade. Two staff members flanked her, their expressions pale and strained as they murmured futile attempts to soothe her. "This is outrageous," Karen snapped, her tone dripping with venom, her arms flailing as if to underscore her indignation. "Do you even know who I am? I'm not some nobody you can brush off." Stella's jaw tightened, though her face remained a mask of composure. She stepped forward, her presence radiating a quiet power that stilled the room without a single raised word. The staff froze, their wide eyes darting to her as Karen, caught up in her tirade, ran it on oblivious. "I'll have your jobs for this," she continued, her voice shrill with entitlement. "This whole place is a sham, letting someone like her treat me like this." Her gesture was vague, aimed at the staff, but the implication hung heavy in the air, a barbed arrow pointed at Stella. "Karen," Stella said, her voice cutting through the chaos with the clarity of a bell tolling midnight. Karen whirled around, her face twisting into a snarl of surprise and fury. "You," she spat, her eyes blazing. "I should have known you'd crawl out of the woodwork. Here to rub it in, are you?" Stella advanced another step, her heels striking the floor with deliberate force, her posture unyielding. "I came to keep this from spiraling further," she said, her tone cool and unshaken. "But it seems you've already lit the fuse." Karen's face flushed crimson, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "Don't you dare talk down to me," she hissed, her voice trembling with rage. "You think you can humiliate me and walk away unscathed? I have people who matter will listen to me, not some power-crazed woman who thinks she runs everything." Stella arched an eyebrow, her expression serene yet piercing. "Karen," she said, "I don't need to think I run anything. I've built my place here, brick by brick, and I stand by it. What I won't stand for is you tearing down the principles this company claims to uphold." Karen let out a harsh, bitter laugh, the sound grating against the taut silence. "Principles, that's rich, coming from you." Her words were a venomous jab, but Stella remained unmoved, her gaze steady as steel. In that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, the staff watching wide-eyed, the security guard shifting uneasily. Karen's defiance was a desperate grasp at power, but Stella's quiet strength revealed the hollowness of it. Here was a lesson unfolding in real time. Justice wasn't just a reaction to wrong, it was a force, a reckoning for those who abused their influence. And as the tension crackled between them, it was clear that Stella wouldn't let that lesson be forgotten. The air in the lounge felt thick with tension as Karen strutted around, her chin tilted upward as if her accomplishments were a crown she wore to lord over everyone else. Stella stood across from her, her eyes steady and unflinching, a quiet storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. Karen's words dripped with arrogance, each syllable a jab meant to elevate herself above the rest. But Stella wasn't shaken. "Success doesn't make anyone better than anyone else," she said, her voice clear and deliberate, cutting through the bravado like a blade. "What matters is how we treat people." Her words landed like stones in still water, rippling outward, heavy with a truth that seemed to pin Karen in place for a fleeting moment. Karen's confident mask wavered, her shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the weight of Stella's conviction pressing down on her fragile ego. She blinked, her lips parting as if to respond, but no words came. For a heartbeat, doubt flickered in her eyes, vulnerability she couldn't afford to let linger. Then, as if clawing her way back to her pride, she straightened, her posture rigid with defiance. "This isn't over," she hissed, her voice dropping to a low, venomous growl that carried a promise of retribution. "People like you always push too far, and when you do, you'll crash just as hard as you climbed." Her sneer twisted her features, a desperate attempt to reclaim the upper hand. Stella tilted her head, her expression a mask of serene indifference, though her mind churned with quiet analysis. "You're welcome to your opinion, Karen," she replied, her tone even and measured. "But if you keep walking this road, the only one you'll end up hurting is yourself." The words weren't a threat, they were a warning, delivered with the calm certainty of someone who'd seen this play out before. Karen's gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken fury. Stella's words had struck a nerve, burrowing beneath Karen's armor, but she refused to let it show. With a sharp huff, she spun on her heel, her expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor like gunfire as she stormed toward the exit. The room fell silent, the sound echoing in her wake, a testament to the chaos she left behind. The staff and security guards watched her go, their faces a patchwork of emotions, relief washing over some, while others still carried the taut strain of the confrontation. Stella let out a soft breath, her composure a steady anchor in the storm's aftermath. She turned to the employees who'd been caught in Karen's crossfire, her eyes softening as she offered them a nod of quiet reassurance. "You all handled yourselves well," she said, her voice warm yet firm. "If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let me know." A young man nearby, his face still drained of color from the ordeal, nodded quickly. "Thank you, Miss Carter," he stammered, his voice shaky but earnest. "I'm sorry you had to deal with that." Stella shook her head gently, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Never apologize for someone else's actions," she told him. Just remember every challenge is a chance to show who you really are. Her words lingered, a lifeline for the rattled staff as they dispersed. Their footsteps quiet against the hum of the now-still lounge. James, her ever-present assistant, approached her then, his brow furrowed with a mix of awe and worry. "Do you think she'll really let this go?" he asked. His voice hushed as if Karen might still hear them from beyond the walls. Stella's lips curved into a faint, bittersweet smile, her eyes distant as she considered the question. "People like Karen don't let go easily," she admitted, "but that's not my burden to carry. My focus is on building something stronger than their ignorance." James nodded, though the tension in his frame didn't ease. He admired her. Stella could see it in the way he hung on her words, but he was still green, still learning that some truths only revealed themselves through time and trial. She knew he'd get there eventually, and for now, she'd keep showing him the way. Resilience wasn't just about weathering the tempest, it was about standing tall when the winds finally died down. With a final glance at the now quiet lounge, its sleek furniture and dim lighting a stark contrast to the drama that had unfolded, Stella turned toward the exit. Her steps were steady, purposeful, her heels tapping a rhythm of resolve against the floor. The day wasn't over, and she knew more battles lay ahead, but she was ready. Justice, she understood, wasn't a finish line you crossed, it was a path you walked, step by deliberate step, no matter how rocky it became. And Stella Carter was prepared to tread it for as long as it took. The tension didn't vanish with Karen's departure. It lingered like smoke, curling around the edges of the room, seeping into the hushed conversations that resumed once she was gone. Stella felt the weight of the staff's glances, their murmured thanks and uneasy silences. She'd crossed paths with people like Karen before, handled unyielding, their arrogance a shield for their insecurities. But this time, something told her Karen's story wasn't finished. There was a thread of unresolved bitterness still dangling, waiting to unravel. 2 days later, Stella sat in her office, perched high above the sprawling city. The morning sun poured through the towering windows, casting golden streaks across her polished glass desk. Papers were stacked neatly beside her laptop, her workspace a mirror of the order she kept in her mind. The skyline stretched out before her, a jagged horizon of steel and glass that shimmered with promise and peril alike. James entered, his arms cradling a file folder, his usual nervous energy buzzing around him like static. "Miss Carter," he said, setting the folder down with a soft thud, "I've got some updates on Karen." Stella arched an eyebrow, her curiosity piqued as she leaned forward slightly. "What updates?" she asked, her voice smooth but edged with interest. James hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of the folder as if weighing how to break the news. "It seems she's been making calls to board members, executives," he said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "She's claiming you mistreated her, that you used your position to humiliate her in front of everyone." His eyes darted to hers, searching for a reaction. Stella leaned back in her chair, her fingers lacing together as she absorbed the information. A flicker of amusement danced in her chest, though her face remained composed. "I see," she said, her tone as steady as ever. "And how have those calls been received?" James's lips twitched into a reluctant smile, a spark of relief breaking through his unease. "Not the way she wanted," he admitted. "Most of them know the truth. They've seen the incident reports, talked to Mr. Linwood. If anything, she's digging herself deeper." Stella allowed herself a brief moment of satisfaction, though it was tempered by the gravity of what Karen's actions implied. "She doesn't strike me as someone who knows when to quit," she mused, her gaze drifting to the window. "But we won't lower ourselves to her level. Let's keep our energy on the bigger picturesque changes we're driving forward." James nodded, his admiration for her shining through the way he straightened up, eager to follow her lead. "Understood," he said. "Oh, and the diversity and inclusion team wanted me to tell you that I've finalized the first round of training materials. They're ready for your review." Her smile widened, a genuine warmth softening her features. "That's excellent news, James. Let's make sure it rolls out smoothly, no delays." He scribbled a note, his pen scratching against the paper, and Stella turned her attention back to the city below, a quiet resolve settling over her. Later that afternoon, her phone buzzed, a sharp interruption to the rhythm of her day. An email from a board member, marked urgent, glowed on the screen. She opened it, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the text. Karen had escalated her grudge to the public Stagia blog post, dripping with venom and distortion. Had gone viral. In it, she cast herself as the wounded party, spinning the lounge incident into a tale of persecution. She accused Stella of wielding her authority like a weapon, of orchestrating a public shaming for her own gain. The post had already ignited a small but loud chorus of supporters, their comments a cacophony of outrage and misplaced loyalty. Stella set the phone down, her expression unreadable, though a storm brewed behind her steady gaze. James, seated across from her with a stack of reports, caught the shift in her demeanor. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. "Karen," she replied simply, her tone unwavering. "She's taken her complaints online." James groaned, dragging a hand through his hair in frustration. "Of course she has. Do you want me to?" "No," Stella cut in, her voice firm but calm. "We don't react with emotion. That's what she's banking on. We'll handle this properly." Her approach was methodical, deliberate. She directed her legal team to release a concise statement, backed by security footage and witness accounts from the lounge, dismantling Karen's lies piece by piece. But she didn't stop there. Seizing the moment, she highlighted the airline's commitment to fairness and inclusion, transforming Karen's attack into a springboard for progress. By week's end, Karen's scheme had imploded spectacularly. The truth emerged, stark and undeniable, and her credibility shattered under its weight. The tide of comments on her blog turned where once there'd been sympathy. Now there was scorn. Her supporters scattered, abandoning her fabricated cause. In a twist of poetic irony, Karen's outburst had amplified the very initiative Stella championed. The airline's diversity and inclusion programs earned glowing praise, and Stella emerged as a beacon of poise and strength, her grace under pressure inspiring all who watched. On Friday evening, as the city lights flickered to life against the deepening sky, Stella sat alone in her office. The silence wrapped around her like a soft blanket, a rare pause in the whirlwind of her days. James slipped in quietly, a steaming cup of tea in his hands. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering a small, tentative smile. She took it, the warmth seeping into her fingers as she met his gaze. "Thank you, James," he lingered, then ventured. "Do you think Karen's learned anything from all this?" Stella sipped her tea, her eyes drifting to the horizon as she pondered the question. "I don't know," she confessed, her voice soft but steady. "But it's not my job to fix her. My job is to make sure people like her don't get to shape the world." James nodded, his respect for her deepening with every quiet word. "And you've done that," he said. "You've shown everyone what real leadership looks like." Her smile was subtle, victorious in its restraint, a quiet acknowledgement of the battles she'd fought and won. "Leadership isn't about perfection," she told him, her gaze returning to the city below. "It's about holding fast to your values, especially when it's tough, especially then." The storm had passed, leaving clarity in its wake, and though more challenges loomed on the horizon, Stella felt a profound peace. For every Karen out there, there were countless others who stood for justice, fairness, and growth. And she'd keep leading them forward, one unwavering step at a time. The lesson here stretched beyond the clash of egos in a lounge, or the petty schemes of a wounded pride. It was a stark reminder of justice's slow, relentless march and the consequences of wielding power without accountability. Karen's downfall wasn't just her own doing, it was the inevitable result of a system that, under Stella's steady hand, refused to bend to arrogance. Every choice she made, every word she spoke, built a legacy of integrity that outshone the fleeting noise of her detractors. And in that, Stella Carter proved that true strength lies not in dominance, but in the quiet, unyielding pursuit of what's right.